Hey there, welcome or welcome back. Today's video is going to be talking about the 3 books that I finished in the month of January. It has been, I would say, sort of a slow kickoff to my reading year, but I'm definitely happy with the books that I read, and they have definitely given me some things to think about, to chew on. So I thought I would talk about them with you all. I'll also mention towards the end some of the books or things that I dipped in and out of but maybe didn't finish in the month of January and what I'm currently reading. So with all that being said, if you're new here, hi, my name is Lillian. I am a writer. I am a avid reader and booktuber here. If you enjoy this video, if you enjoy the vibes, feel free to subscribe. I would love to have you. I guess we'll start with the book that I finished most recently, and that is a collection of poems by none other than Louise Gluck, I believe is how you pronounce her name. This is Averno. This is my first poetry collection by her. Sorry, catching the light in the reflection here of the book cover, but this was an incredible collection of poetry that I kind of devoured over the course of about a week and have been dipping in and out of here and there. Poetry is something that I really like to go back to even after I finish the collection and just sort of sample here and there, but Louise Gluck is a poet that I have really been meaning to pick up, and I'm really happy that I picked up a collection by her. I will be definitely looking forward to reading more of her work, but the collection itself is, it's magnificent. Let me read you a little snapshot from the description on the flap here. It says, Averno is a small crater lake in southern Italy, regarded by the ancient Romans as the entrance to the underworld. That place gives its name to Louise Gluck's 10th collection in a landscape turned irretrievably to winter. It is a gate or passageway that invites traffic between worlds, while at the same time resisting their reconciliation. Like all of Gluck's collections since Averno, Averno proceeds as a sequence. It is an extended lamentation, its long, restless poems, no less spellbinding for being without conventional resolution or consolation, no less ravaging for being savage, grief-stricken. How can I endure the earth? Persephone asks at the moment of her forced return. What Averno provides is not a map to a point of arrival or departure, but a diagram of where we are, the harrowing, enduring present, in which the ecstatic and inevitable are irrevocably fused. So if that gives you a little bit of a taste of what this collection entails. There's definitely a focus on points and moments of transition, whether throughout a life, throughout a soul's journey. There's definitely some poems in here that feature the myth of Persephone in Hades, as well as one from the perspective of Persephone's mother, Demeter. Again, playing into the namesake of this collection, Averno, the point, sort of the precipice between life and death, the transitional period, the transitional place. Trying to find a little snippet of a poem that I would really like to read to you to give you a little bit of a taste of this collection. So I'll read to you section 4 of the longer poem in here titled October. The light has changed. Middle sea is tuned darker now, and the songs of morning sound over-rehearsed. This is the light of autumn, not the light of spring. The light of autumn, you will not be spared. The songs have changed, the unspeakable has entered them. This is the light of autumn, not the light that says I am reborn. Not the spring dawn, I strained, I suffered, I was delivered. This is the present, an allegory of waste. So much has changed, and still you are fortunate. The ideal burns in you like a fever, or not like a fever, like a second heart. The songs have changed, but really they are still quite beautiful. They have been concentrated in a smaller space, the space of the mind. They are dark now with desolation and anguish, and yet the notes reoccur. They hover oddly in anticipation of silence. The ear gets used to them. The eyes get used to disappearances. You will not be spared, nor will what you love be spared. The wind has come and gone, taking apart the mind. It has left in its wake a strange lucidity. How privileged you are to be still passionately clinging to what you love. The forfeit of hope has not destroyed you. Maestro doloroso, translation, majestic and painful. This is the light of autumn. It has turned on us. Surely it is a privilege to approach the end still believing in something. Yeah, Louise Gluck. I will for sure be picking up more of her work, and I can already see this as being one of my favorite books that I read this year, and I do plan on continuing to dip in and out of it throughout the year. I started in December and finished in January re-listening to the audiobook of Christmas Days, 12 Stories, 12 Feasts for 12 Days by Jeanette Winterson. This is her winter/Christmas short story collection that came out, I think, a number of years ago, but I listened to it for the first time, I think 2 or 3 years ago at this point, and it is one of my favorite short story collections, one of my favorite audiobooks, to be honest. The narrator for the fiction stories does a fantastic job, but also there are interludes where Jeanette Winterson is talking about some of her own Christmas or winter traditions, memories surrounding them, people that have passed down recipes to her. She has a wonderful voice and a wonderful sense of humor, and it was really fun to re-listen to this collection while I was doing some crafting over the winter holidays. It was interesting re-listening to this collection a second time. I definitely loved all of the stories, but I think the ones that really have continued to stand out to me have been the ones that are more so along the lines of ghost stories. She has, I think, 3 or 4 of them in the collection, and they are haunting in a very meaningful and interesting way. And as someone who is a self-professed scaredy cat, I do not like scary things. The stories themselves were enough to give me a little bit of a spine tingle, but not enough to scare me to the point where I couldn't sleep. They were more so thought-provoking rather than horrifying, shall we say. Yeah, it was lovely to re-listen to that collection, and if you are in the mood in the future for a festive holiday, Christmas, winter short story collection, would highly recommend picking it up, especially the audiobook if that's something that you enjoy doing. And then the final book that I read in January, I realized I have left all the way upstairs, so I will just put it up on the screen next to me here. That is The Fall by Albert Camus. This is one that I picked up, I believe, at the beginning of January, and I have continued to think about and mentally chew on since I read it. It is a short volume. It is, I believe, under 100 pages, somewhere in the realm of 90, 95 pages, the edition that I have. And I'm going to be referencing some of the reading notes that I took on this book because there's a lot to unpack, and I feel like for such a short book, it definitely had a lot to say, and I feel like I have a lot to say about it. So let's jump on in. The Fall was originally published in 1956 and was Camus' final published piece of fiction before he tragically died in an automobile accident. The book itself takes place in the city of Amsterdam, where we are following a series of very dramatic monologues by the main character, the self-proclaimed Judge Penitent, Jean-Baptiste Clements. I apologize to any French speakers on my pronunciation of the names here, as he reflects on the course of his life to a stranger, aka the audience. You're sort of being talked at, monologue to. The narrative itself and the monologues are styled after a confession of sorts. Clements tells you of his past as a very successful rights lawyer in Paris, dealing in what he calls only widows and orphans cases, where he built up a very highly reputable profession and public image and was respected by his colleagues. But he begins to experience a series of personal crises that cause him to confront his own hypocrisy and really take a look at himself and realize that he is not the entirely selfless, compassionate human being that he has sort of viewed and extolled himself to be. And he begins, quote unquote, falling from grace, shall we say. There are definitely some secular parallels to the fall of man from the Garden of Eden. Prior to the series of internal crises that he experiences, Clements views himself as an inherently selfless person who is only living for the sake of others, but there are a few instances that start to sow the seeds of doubt in his mind as to whether he is truly an altruistic person or not. The first being one night where he is walking home from a late night out. He walks across a bridge in the city and there is a young woman standing on the edge, and after he has passed by, he hears that she has jumped into the river, and he considers going in after her but decides against it because at this point it's winter and he would very likely be risking his own life in order to attempt to save this young woman. A year following that incident, he is walking across that same bridge during the daytime, lights himself a cigarette as a way to congratulate himself on a good day of work when he begins to hear this disembodied laughter behind him, and the laughter reminds him of his failure to jump into the river and save that young woman, which results in a collision between his true self and his self-inflated image, and he begins to realize that his whole life has been lived in search of honor, recognition, and power over others. Thus begins his big internal crisis, where he is sort of confronting his own ego, confronting his own hypocrisy. He continues to hear the disembodied laughter in his life when there are moments where his actions start to contradict his internal monologue, thus beginning his fall from grace. He attempts to destroy his own self-image of this very stand-up pillar of society, but the people in his life don't believe him. They think, well, how can you be this awful person that you say that you are? And so he ends up retreating from his old life to a life that is lived in, shall we say, the red light district of the city, closing his law practice, withdrawing from the world, drinking very heavily, throwing himself headlong into debauchery, if you will. During the Second World War, he ends up fleeing Paris and going to Tunis in the north of Africa, where he is eventually captured by Germans and put in a concentration camp there. While in the camp, he is elected as the group's quote-unquote pope, and is afforded certain powers over others, mainly distribution of materials, and is given the role of confessor, of being the person that people come to in order to confess their sins and sort of have judgment passed over them. After the war, he ends up settling in Amsterdam in the seedy red light part of town, and sets up in a dive bar there and begins his ministering or his confessing to whoever will listen to him. And this is where he begins to identify as a judge penitent. There is a discussion of how he, after coming to Amsterdam, sort of stole a panel from the Ghent altarpiece titled The Last Judges. He actually stole it from the bar owner where he tends to do his ministering from. He tries to justify his stolen possession in a number of ways, primarily, quote, and I'll read this quote here, "Because the judges are on their way to meet the Lamb, because there is no lamb or innocence any longer, and because the clever rascal who stole the panel was an instrument of the unknown justice that one ought not to thwart," pointing to the idea that fate has taken the place of God in the main character's mind. I will say personally, up until maybe like the last fourth of the book, where you have Clement sort of giving you his current worldview and his current role, self-imposed role of judge penitent, I was really intrigued by the book. Clement, I will say, even when he is in his, say, golden boy phase, I won't say for me he was a very likable character. He was definitely interesting to read about and sort of chew on the morality of, but towards the end there is definitely this heavier philosophical flip when Clement is sort of telling you about his current sort of philosophies, his mode of operating, and I think I'll get into those in a minute here, but I think personally I will say that I don't agree with them. On the other hand, I don't necessarily think that Camus inherently wanted people to agree, more so having the narrator and the book itself be a point of discussion and a jumping off point, philosophical jumping off point. So I think the best way to go about this is to read from the reading notes that I took so I can sort of articulate this properly. Clemence talks about, as a judge penitent, having this doctrine of the need to relinquish freedom, personal freedom, as a method of enduring the suffering imposed on us by the virtue of living in a world without objective truth, and one that is therefore ultimately meaningless. Clemence argues that with the death of God, one must also accept by extension the idea of universal guilt and the impossibility of innocence, which just made me think that Camus, who I believe was an atheist, and so is this main character, of you have just taken sort of the structure and the hierarchy of guilt imposed by, say, the Catholic Church, which, you know, was very prominent in France, and just taken the God part away and just left the guilt. Which, why would you do that? Clemence argues that freedom from suffering is attained through submission to something greater than oneself, which I can get on board with, but the terminology that he is heavily using is that of slavery and enslaving others or enslaving yourself, which, in Clemence's view, through his confession to you, the audience, he sits in permanent judgment of himself and others, spending his time persuading those around him of their own unconditional guilt. Now, this final section and other previous parts of the book definitely are wrestling with the nature of individual freedom, of human relationships, power, and what it means to live honestly with one another. Apologies, I don't know where exactly I got cut off, but my camera battery died, so I had to take an hour or two to let that charge. Something that this book has definitely had me thinking about is Clemence's posturing as this sort of judge penitent of sitting firmly within the realm of judgment and firmly defined lines of guilt and innocence, and reckoning with Clemence's idea that there is universal guilt and that there's no such thing as innocence anymore, that there's no such thing as universal truth. So out of that dichotomy of thinking and the chaos or the unknown of living, I guess you could argue that Clemence is trying to impose some sort of structure or some sort of order in his mind in order to face and move through the world, but by doing so he is sort of rigidly putting himself and others within the parameters of guilt and confession, much in the same way that organized religion would, which is interesting. I have a note here that says, Clemence would believe that your own guilt enables you to pass judgment on everyone else, guilt as a universal equalizer of sorts, and as an atheist, he doesn't think that God can punish man and that only man can pass judgment and punishment on each other. As a means of finding relief from this potentially all-consuming or universal sense of guilt, Clemence sees his own confession of sin to others as a way for him to be clear to pass judgment on others, which doesn't really sit well with me personally. By judging himself, Clemence sees that as a way to prevent others from judging him, thus allowing him to regain the sense of power and superiority he had experienced when he believed himself to be the noblest, kindest man in Paris. You could argue that his new modus operandum of judge penitent is really just another means to sort of elevate himself to a level that is above judgment, above reproach. After finishing the book, I definitely was sitting with it for a little bit, but then also went and looked up some critique that had been written about it and some things that other people had said about it, and two things that I noted as sort of interesting and wanted to chew on a little bit more. The idea that the audience's disdain for Clemence is arguably our disdain for our own hypocritical and selfish natures. It is sort of Camus putting the mirror up in front of us and asking us, can you say that you're any better than this person? Can you say that you are an entirely selfless human being or believe yourself to be when in reality you may not be? But also that Clemence's anti-solution to the problem of universal guilt and judgment is a challenge posed by Camus for the reader to find a real solution to suffering within the human condition. Only then will we be able to absolve our own human guilt, which I thought was interesting. The ideas of guilt and judgment are definitely central sort of themes in this book. Part of one of Clemence's monologues that sort of caught my eye and I've also been thinking about is him talking about his time in a concentration camp, and he makes a comment along the lines of the suffering and the brutality of the camps that the children of the 20th century are well aware of. Camus himself, as a writer, was a witness to the Second World War and the occupation of Paris by the Nazis. It really has me thinking sort of about the context and the mentality that Camus might have had when approaching writing this character and his approach to sort of this philosophical debate that his character is sort of working through as someone who was part of a society that had very recently witnessed extreme brutality and cruelty and human suffering as a result of the Second World War. So I've been sitting with and chewing on how that likely would have shaped Camus' outlook and the way that Camus is posturing things in this novel. Stable societies of Europe being upended by the Second World War and the cruelty and mass loss of human life that came with it, and coming out the other side and asking, well, how do we make sense of this? How do we wrestle with the reality of what has happened? How do we make sense of it ideologically? So a very interesting read, one that I think I will be thinking about quite a bit in the future. And I definitely have plans to read some more Camus this year. I definitely found, well, I didn't necessarily agree with some of the points that his main character at least was making. I definitely found his writing style and his questions that he was posing to be very interesting. So I have The Plague by him on my shelf, and so I hope to pick that up possibly in the spring or summer of this year. And then finally, I wanted to mention some of the books that I read parts of in January but did not fully finish. So they're sort of still in my reading orbit as of right now. So first being Survival is a Promise, The Eternal Life of Audre Lorde by Alexis Pauline Gumbs. This is a new biography out about Audre Lorde, and as you can see, it's quite a chunky book, and I have very slowly been making my way through it. I am enjoying it. I think it's taken me a little bit to get through it. I think I've been reading this since I picked it up this past summer, but I definitely feel like I want to take my time with it. But also, the author of this biography is a poet herself, which lends a really interesting perspective to Audre Lorde's life, and she is also someone who has done a whole ton of research on Audre Lorde and had a long-standing love and admiration for Audre's work. So that really shines through in this biography. But also, I think this biography is definitely non-linear. It is not necessarily structured in a way that I'm used to reading biographies in. So I feel like that has thrown a little bit of a curveball into my reading experience of this, but I'm still definitely enjoying this, and like I said, slowly making my way through this, and I'm hoping to finish it this coming month of February. I also started dipping into the new winter 2025 edition of the Liberties Culture and Politics journal. This is a local DC based journal, and I've been reading some of the essays in here. Likewise, I have also been dipping back into the Allen Ginsberg poetry collection for moral support, shall we say. This has been wonderful. And then finally, the book that I picked up, I think a couple days ago. So I started on the very last day of January. This is Little Man, What Now by Hans Fallada. This is an interesting piece of Weimar Germany literature. This published, I think, 1934, 1935, sort of right at the culmination and rise of the Nazi Party in Germany during the Weimar Republic. And we're following a young couple who has recently just gotten married, sort of a shotgun wedding of the young lady finds out that she is expecting, and they are very much in love, and so they decide to make a go of it and get married. And it's sort of them facing off against some of the societal hurdles, shall we say, during this time period of money being very tight, of political unrest, of trying to make a life for themselves in a world that is becoming increasingly more unstable. This book so far has been surprisingly lighthearted and kind of amusing, sort of tongue-in-cheek, even when dealing with some heavier anecdotes or topics. So I will keep you posted on this when I finish it. But yeah, I think that brings us to the end of this video. If you've read any of these books, please let me know what your thoughts were on them in the comments. And also, if you want to share what you've been reading recently, what was your favorite book that you finished in the month of January, let me know in those comments. But I hope you all are doing well and taking care, and I will see you in my next video. Bye.